Presenting. And we're live. Here it is. Here's this Agile thing. My name's Matt Bean.
I'm Mike Markey. And we're sending greetings out to everyone out there.
Yes, we are. Jeff Singleton is not with us this week. He is feeling, let's say, under the weather. So
he said he got himself some bad food.
Yeah, having recently been there, I feel, I know what that's like. Feel better, Jeff.
Absolutely.
Anyway, we're here every Saturday.
10 a.m. Central.
Yeah, totally. Happy weekend. What is new, Mike?
What is new? Have you been paying any attention to the LinkedIn-osphere for the last week or two?
Not a whit. I am out of the loops.
Sometimes the LinkedIn-osphere comes. That's right. You were feeling poorly yourself, so maybe you weren't keeping up on it. But sometimes people bring up a topic, or a topic arises that just creates a fervor of activity, a bunch of responses. And this one was an announcement of basically a press release that was put out by the Agile Alliance, and I believe also by the PMI. But the Agile Alliance and the PMI have joined forces, in effect.
So for those who aren't aware, the Agile Alliance is a group of people who behave in an agile manner and certify people to do thusly. Is that correct?
That is not correct. The Agile Alliance doesn't certify anybody. So the Agile Alliance is really, if you want to say, it's the nonprofit org that is the keeper of the flame of what is termed agility. They're the guys that have the conferences every year around the world that you can come and talk to and say, hey, let's talk about all things Agile. Anything Agile related and whatever the new thing is, or the old thing or the practical thing or whatever. And there's usually a lot of money in that. They charge a good chunk of change for that 5-day conference.
So here's a difficult and potentially impolite question. Are they at all responsible for the current state of Agile?
I don't think so, since they're not the certifying body, right? They're not the ones who are trying to sell training. They're not the ones trying. They're really just acting as call it a public clearinghouse for the whatever the current definition is.
Okay.
I mean, there's usually some of the Agile luminaries or whoever the big voices are sitting on the board of that thing, and they're involved in it. But at any rate,
yes.
The alternative to that, or maybe the mirror image of that, would be the PMI. So the Project Management Institute.
Got it.
The keepers of the flame, but they do house, or not only do they do events, they have many conferences and they have many events and gatherings of project management professionals, but they also certify project managers with the PMP and tie things to the PMBOK, the Project Management Body of Knowledge.
Sure, it's not a book? Might be a book of knowledge.
Oh, is it? I don't know.
So. I don't know anything about the PMI, but I think it's a book of knowledge.
Well, you've probably seen their work, right?
I'm sure I have.
You've encountered those who are aligned to the ways of the PMI. And for when we first got into the Agile space, it always felt like what we were doing as with Scrum or with Agile, we were trying to counter the old ways of thinking, and the old ways of thinking were just sort of like represented by what the PMI was putting out there. They were, and so project managers, by and large, had a playbook, a body of knowledge that talked about all sorts of practices that were designed to get control over project delivery. And it wasn't just for software, right? It was just, I believe it was any project.
Can I ask a question without interjecting rudefully? Rudefully is not a word.
I don't know. Can you?
I'm not sure. Let's find out. You describe it as the old way of working. I'm wondering if an alternate way of describing it is an alternate way of working that's appropriate in some cases where there is less uncertainty. Eh,
Yes, and that's the thing is, and I was putting myself in that time frame back then, right?
Okay.
So back in 2001, or for me it was 2005, when we were trying to bring an alternate way of working into our well-established workplace, that was viewed as the new thing versus the old thing.
yeah.
yeah,
I raised
it's-
that because one of the things I've been
But
thinking about
it's
is
a good point. Yeah, go on.
Yeah. So I think sometimes I run into people who have the perception, or maybe it's just my perception that this is what they're thinking, but sometimes I get the sense that whatever the Agile thing is replaces project management. And my sense is that there are different approaches that are appropriate based on the nature of the work and basically the level of uncertainty from sort of a Cynefin point of view. We'll
Absolutely.
need both of them going forward, is another way to say it.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot to be said for that. If we look, and you mentioned Cynefin. If we look at Cynefin and we say, there are, you could be sitting in the middle of the uncertain, chaosy part in the middle where you go, I don't know where I am yet, and you're handed a piece of work. It's a sense making framework. So the idea is you're supposed to be able to evaluate that and then say what's the most appropriate way to address it. Is this super simple? Is this chaotic or unknowable, or is this just simply complicated, or is it complex? And if you're complex, we kind of have come to the conclusion that an iterative approach that with frequent feedback cycles might be more effective because there's too many of the wrong types of unknowns there, or the right. And then as opposed to we've gone down this path before, we understand it fairly well. It's a matter of managing the outcome. Maybe it's just complicated. Let's take a more deterministic pathway to get there. So the more traditional project management approach could be more effective.
Yeah, Cynefin describes various, I don't know what they call them, domains or areas. So there's the simple domain where it's just what it sounds like. There's relatively few things, relatively uncomplicated interactions. And if I get this wrong, please everybody, correct me and we'll talk about it. There's simple, there's complicated, where there's a lot of entities and a lot of interactions that are complicated, but knowable, still tractable. And then beyond that, there is the complex domain where there's so much stuff going on, and the interactions are so voluminous, like literally human beings don't have enough brain, like we cannot map that stuff. Think about like how you'd model the climate, for example. Like you cannot do that at a level of resolution. That's probably an unnecessarily. But there are some places where you just can't see cause and effect. That's the thing, right? It's impossible to predict because you don't know enough. You can't model it accurately enough to be able to make predictions that are reliable. So that's kind of what Cynefin is. And so what we're saying essentially is that project management works great for complicated stuff because you can still make a list of all the stuff and all the things and the interactions and predict. But when you get it complex, by way of analogy, it's like if you're driving a car, right? Simple is you're just in your driveway, right? You can go back and forth and there's like nothing to it, obviously. Complicated is you're driving to Arizona. Okay, there's a lot of turns, but you can make a list and you can adjust. Complex is it's 100% dense fog. You can't see in front of you. Like maybe you can see 10 feet in front of you, so you go 10 feet as far as you can see. You make decisions for as far as you can see, and then you have to reevaluate and because you just can't tell what's going to happen after 10 feet. Does that make sense? Is that fair? Kinda.
I don't know if I would have gone to total fog, but I would. Complex might be trying to get to a destination by driving through a series of construction zones where you have to take detours frequently to find better paths because the way you thought you were going to go turns out to be blocked off, or traffic is slower. That's the way I tend to think of complex a little bit more. The total fog, that might be the middle where you don't know where you are or how you're going to get there. I don't know.
I guess the essence of it is it's unknowable. Like what you will end up having done is unknowable when you start. So you have to iterate.
Yeah. Either that or you have an idea of the destination. You just don't know how you're getting there. Right. We know what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
So you can apply Agile in a couple of different ways, and we've seen it. There's some ways where you just go, we have a need, we're going to solve this need, and then we're going to solve another need and solve another need. And by the time you're done, you've iterated your way to a thing that you could not have foreseen in the beginning. But then there's the other way of looking at it where you've got a definite idea of where you want to get, but we don't know what technology we're going to use. We don't know what methods are going to work. We don't even know what features are going to be useful to somebody in that space yet. So we're going to use frequent check and adapt cycles in order to figure that out.
Yeah, you've got a goal, because otherwise it's not worth it to leave the house.
It's tough to get funding without a goal.
Why would you?
Hey,
pay
we'd
for
like to
anything?
work and deliver no value. What the heck? No, we'll deliver value. You won't know what it is.
Yeah, it'll be a surprise.
You won't even necessarily know how to realize that value.
So the reason I raise that is because sometimes I get the sense that there's project management versus agility or flow, and I guess what I'm saying, it's not an either or, it's a both and, depending on what you're trying to do, where you are.
There might be another way to look at it. It's not an either or both. It's a continuum. Like there's things that are purely knowable, and there's things that are purely unknowable, and then there's the reality of where we sit is maybe closer to that boundary between complex and complicated. Most organizations, and maybe that's why so many places just feel compelled to go with some hybrid model that's a little bit of waterfall, a little bit of agile, and they try to just keep going that way so they can fall off the wall on either side, or maybe just stay trapped. It just might, maybe that's what's driving that.
It depends on how they look at it, right? If they're doing a little bit of this and a little bit of that, just to cover all their bases, that seems like it might not be. Again, you got to pick the right tool for the right situation, and if it's a little bit, if it's based on the complexity, I can see why you do that. But if you just want to include everything, like using a multi-tool is not always the best. You want the optimized tool for the job. Yeah.
Sometimes that's better. You can get away with the multi-tool. You might take longer. You might hurt a few things. You might strip a couple of bolts as you're trying to get through it, but you'll get the job done. And that's kind of where Agile got its start, was looking at the traditional project management way of approaching things, that big design up front, many phase gates, try and do things in big chunks. The error-prone nature of that, especially in software, right? Agile was brought in as a counter to that, to say, you've gotten stuff done. You used the wrong tool for the job, but you got it done, and it was painful, but we got there. And Agile was kind of seen as, without realizing it, maybe, that things are more in the complex space. So let's find a way of bringing structure to what we do that allows for the things to change, that allows for frequent feedback, for all those other things that would maintain control.
Well, I mean, in some cases we got stuff done, but isn't there there's a series of, or a set of studies. I think one of them was from, the Standish group that found that the majority of software projects failed. Like, they didn't meet the date, they went over budget, they didn't achieve the ends.
Yes.
Like, software it's a risky business. Well,
because it's the standard way of doing project management was to treat it like a knowable thing. So so if you were to say, we're going to do a big requirements gathering thing, the implication is you've figured out all the requirements up front. You know everything you need it to do. Right? And then you're going to go design a solution. And the implication there is that this knowable list of things has a knowable way of approaching it, that you can come up with a with a good plan for delivery of it. And then you go into development of it, which the conceit is we're working with people who have done work for us before, and based on whatever magic the project managers had at their disposal, usually spreadsheets or Microsoft project things, I can guesstimate when I think they're going to get this stuff done and give you a date. And then we can start, as you are fond of saying, make the plan.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Plan the work and work the plan.
Yeah, that's it. Plan the work the plan. And then there was the whole validation cycle, which is where things tended to explode, because that's when testers would start finding all the faults in the system that the very optimistic developers failed to protect against. And I was in that environment. I spent many years as a software developer in that environment, and we were continually late over budget. We were on average for a year-long project 2 months late, and consequently over budget because of that.
Yeah.
And that the thing that drove us into the Agile space was a proclamation that we had to become more predictable. We had to find a way to be more predictable.
Yeah.
Right? Because this is a costly thing if you're continually late. And the realization that project management method implies that you can predict how long it's going to take to write lines of code the same way you can predict how long it takes to stamp out a widget on an assembly line. And it's two different things.
Yeah.
Right. And we said this before, writing software is an act of creation. It's more art than science. Sure, there's a lot of science in there, but my argument still holds true. You give the same problem to two developers, they will solve the problem. They will both solve the problem, but the two outcomes will look completely different. One will arrange things differently. Some might have more elegant solutions in one space or another. It's more of an artistic endeavor, and therefore harder to quantify and harder to control.
Yeah, and again, this project management approach is not wrong per se. I mean, if you're an architect or in construction, you know how many bricks you'll need. But in knowledge work, it's almost like the bricks can turn into something else over time, right? Like the building blocks are soft.
Yeah. Like
they're malleable.
Are there uncertainties in there? Like, there's people who will say, well, we're going to spin up a database. We're going to create this whole thing. And there's no way we can deliver this giant database structure in an incremental way. We can't give you, and they'll say that, right?
Yeah.
And that's and maybe because that is a more knowable outcome, that fact of creating the database or getting it. They've done that a million times. They know what it takes to get it up and running. Once you've established that infrastructure, then the stuff you put into the infrastructure might be a more complex activity, right? The things that we place in there, but you want to lay some groundwork. So some things are more suited for the one side of the wall versus the other. And that's so to go back to what started this conversation.
Yeah, the PMI versus the Agile Alliance.
Yeah, as opposed to a versus, now it's a plus, right? Now,
yeah.
So Agile Alliance has said they're joining forces with the PMI. I think they're now going to call themselves the PMI Agile Alliance. And
so what does that mean from a practical point of view? How does that impact? Because I'm not a member of either. But
I suppose it would mean I don't know what they're going to do membership wise, right? There is a thing for that. You can be a member of the Agile Alliance, and that gets you access to some library of knowledge. It gets you reduced rates at the events, things like that. Mm-hmm. I don't know if they'll translate, if they'll be transferable, if they'll meld into one membership thing. I don't know if they've decided all that yet, but it could mean that, a membership in one automatically gets you a membership in both. And that, the Agile Alliance probably got to this point out of a sense of if the best way that you get money is by holding giant events, and the world decides but giant events aren't going to be useful for a couple of years.
Yeah, that's unfortunate.
Yeah. So I think they may have been suffering from some financial struggles after that. And I would imagine if it wasn't for the PMI certifications, they probably were having the same problem with the event coordination side of the house, right?
Yeah.
But they did have a difference. They did do the certification, and to be fair to the PMI, they weren't just traditional project management all the time. They've gone through an evolution as well. They started acknowledging that Agile existed and was a thing. And I remember going to PMI events in Chicago and being a speaker about Agile and looking at a sea of faces just with that. Like this. Where's your RACI diagram? And they've grown a lot since then. They've acknowledged that this exists. There's certainly always going to be people who really were so comfortable in that well-trodden, well-defined space that they found that to be their home because it was very, very rigidly defined, and we can do that. It's a lot of checklists. I'm comfortable with that, right? Yeah. And they looked at Agile as it's the Wild West, right? It's there's no rules. It's just a bunch of people riding out on horses shooting at each other. And it's not.
But if you take,
but it wasn't. We knew it wasn't, but that's what they saw, right?
Yeah.
Compared to the rigid structure, it was a little bit more loosey-goosey than they were comfortable with.
Yeah, everybody I know who's successful with anything you could describe as an Agile approach is obsessed with acceptance criteria or definition of done, whatever sort of phrase that they use to capture it. It's like, what would you say you're doing here, Bob? Like, what does good look like? What does acceptable look like? Let's find the people who have the authority and control or whoever it is that can say, yes, this is good enough. Get them in front of this and say, are we done? If not, what's the gap? Specifically, write it down so that we can iterate. And so the iteration part of it could feel like chaos because you're trying to give people as much leeway and flexibility and to be as creative as possible. But it's always, for it to work, you have to have an obsessive focus on, did it work? Basically, whatever work means in that context. Yeah.
All right. So to continue that point, though, we had PMI started acknowledging Agile existed, started seeing value in it, and they created an Agile equivalent of the PMBOK, and that led to this other certification they did called the ACP. So the PMI ACP was their Agile practice or Agile practitioner thing, and it was every bit as rigorous as going through the PMP was. And they did that for a while, and that they tried selling that as a framework, and it didn't get a lot of traction because it was I didn't even look at it enough to be able to speak intelligently on that. If we had a listener who was familiar with the ACP, they could do that.
Talk to us, listener.
But we're well aware of where they went next. We had Scott Ambler on here. So the PMI adopted or absorbed or bought or licensed or in some way had a legal thing, a legal entity that they put together to acquire Disciplined Agile. And Disciplined Agile, so then it was for a little while PMI, there's PMP, there's ACP, and there's also this DA thing. And that, Scott used to call that a framework. They don't call that a framework anymore. Now DA is more of a toolbox, kind of, right? But
the distinction being a framework is a thing that you install and you need all the parts of the framework because it all works together in an integrated whole like a grandfather clock. And if you take out the mainspring, the whole thing breaks, whereas a toolbox is a set of things that may or may not be useful based on the application in your context that you need to apply discernment to be successful with. That was a long sentence.
That's good. That's good. But I think somewhere in there is a thing where you say, and I don't just go in and say, I'm only going to pick one tool out of the toolbox and only use that one. It's there's a selection of, it's sort of a choose your own adventure methodology. So DA apparently, now we had the same conversation at the APLN, the Agile Professional Learning Network meetup this week, and we had a couple of folks there who were from PMI, and they are involved in PMI, and they said that now DA isn't a separate certification through PMP; it's rolled into the ACP. So it's still so they still had their traditional project management cert, and they still have an Agile cert. But they're trying to, so maybe what this means is that the Agile Alliance, to go back to this thing, Agile Alliance gains a little bit more horsepower in attendance, because to support an ACP, you're going to need to send people to conferences, and traditional project management conferences aren't going to be as interesting to them as something that's going to delve more into some of the other Agile practices, and they don't quite have the same luminaries or the same chop. They'd have to pull people in from the Agile space anyway in order to make a good conference out of that. So maybe that's strategically, from the PMI standpoint, that makes perfect sense. That they're going to, now that we've absorbed this giant, discipline Agile thing, we need a better way of supporting that. They would end up creating probably Agile shaped conferences that would be in direct competition with the Agile Alliance.
Yeah.
So in that sense, just buy the property, right?
Yeah, but I mean, if you were a person who was responsible for shipping solutions, right? Let's say you were a medium-sized company and you had solutions that you needed to create in a complex space. Would you be looking for somebody who had an ACP certification or a DA certification or a LESS certification or a SAFE certification or no certificate? Like what? How do you think about that?
There is a difference between what I would look for and what other people would look for. Certifications, we've had many conversations on this, are not necessarily a reflection of knowledge or a reflection of a capability. They're a reflection of knowledge. You've passed a class in which knowledge was thrown at you. And if it was one that involved a test, then you've managed to regurgitate that knowledge back and answer the questions the way they were presented to you. Yeah. But that's still no substitute for practical experience.
Yeah.
Right. And so we're not gonna get deep into the concept of 2 days gets you a master class education in something. Clearly
it's tough. I mean, we're not board certified. We're not professionals in the sense that, like if a civil engineer screws up, right, and the bridge falls down and people die, like there's a certification that was absolutely set up to prevent that, and it would represent a failure of that certification and accreditation system. Like my dad used to be an airline pilot, right? And there was absolutely a procedure for everything. And they would bring him into recurrent training every year and put him in the simulator and simulate an engine blowing out or something. And like there was a right way to solve that problem, and there was a million wrong ways to do it. And if you didn't do it right, and I guess
there was a non-optimal outcome.
Yeah, there was a way you were supposed to do it, and you got certified if you knew that or not, and or you didn't get certified. And I guess I just don't feel like we have that level of clarity in this space.
Well, and I can see that. I'm trying to imagine. As you were saying that, I'm going, yeah, we should do that. And then another part of me went, no way, we shouldn't do that. And then another part of me, so I was like oscillating back and forth. Like, that's a great idea. That's a terrible idea. I don't know.
Yeah. Right.
I don't know if it's possible. I mean, if you look at something like the PMBOK and you say, look how big this book is. And apparently there's a new 8th edition for fans of the PMBOK. There's an 8th edition coming out that's on
fans of the PMBOK
for a few more days at least. It's on a free beta view thing. If you're a member of the PMI, you can look at it online and offer criticisms or offer suggestions.
Yeah.
So you can find that if you go to the PMI website. I'll put the link up here. But By the time you see this, it's probably the window will probably be closed.
No, our
unless you're looking
cycle
at it
time has
live.
gone way down, way
That
down.
is true.
We're
That is
going to
true.
get stuff out within
We're
7
going to
days.
get this out here.
Yes.
It's still, you may have hours left, but go in and give your feedback. Where was I going with that? Should we do so when you have this giant body of knowledge, you can test people's knowledge of the body of knowledge, and the implication has to be that they've covered all the bases, all the things you could possibly run into in a project execution world.
Having the knowledge and executing it correctly will lead to the outcome, right? And in aviation, it's a very easy test. The plane crashes or it doesn't, right? Whereas here, it's like, well, we were successful or not, and like you can move those goalposts, and like
Yeah, but isn't there a continuum in landing a plane too? Like the plane lands safely and without damage, and the plane lands in an utter pile of scrap. Somewhere in between, there's the plane landed, but it something fell off a shelf. I mean,
I'm sure when you get into the details, there are gradients, but like essentially, you took up 167 souls and you brought them back down intact.
There's
That's
movies
really the
all
test.
over the place about people who take the plane up and they manage to land it on the river, and then it's like,
oh yeah, and that's what that movie was about. He
Yeah.
did it wrong. No, actually, he didn't do it wrong. He did it
Right.
in a way that transcended your rules that were not actually applicable. Right? That's what that. I don't know if you've seen that movie, Sully.
I haven't yet, but I've been peripherally seen it. I want to. I like Tom Hanks movies. Those are always
that movie
good.
was really moving to me. I think it's because my dad was a pilot, but it really made me cry because like he went up there and the whole thing was he got criticized, right?
Yeah.
Because they're like, hey, if you look at this, you should have done this and 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 this, and he's like, actually, no, that's not how it works. Let's recreate this. Like you had all the time in the world to do all the armchair quarterbacking, right?
Yeah.
And I'm telling you, you had 47 seconds to make the decision, right? And so it wasn't so like the rules that you want to apply, that's
Right.
not how it works. You needed a human being to execute that. There's a scene there where they're going down, and the captain Sully looks over and he says to the first officer, he says, "You got any ideas?" And I'm like, holy shit, 107 souls he's responsible for. He's got maybe 2 minutes to make this decision, and he is like, okay, right? And so. Yeah, ultimately, that's a good example of, the value there is clear. Those people survived, right?
Yeah.
And maybe it wasn't according to the book, but maybe that's a criticism of the book, right? And not the people who were in the arena.
Well, we run into that all the time. Is it wasn't in the book? Something happens, and when that thing happens, then they change the rules. They write a new chapter of the book. They put something else in there. We're going to now prevent that from happening by making a new rule around it. And eventually, your SDLC and your organization is so overwhelmed with rules and specialized things that have essentially lost meaning. Nobody knows why this rule exists. It's just the way we do things around here.
Right. And it's not to say we shouldn't have rules and books of knowledge and all that stuff, but overweighting that, right, and putting it out of the level in the hierarchy of values where it should sit, it's not more important than the outcome.
Yeah.
Right? And people confuse that all the time.
I certainly don't want to be insensitive or oversimplify the plane crash concept, but at some point, we're going off book here. Now it's all about soft landing this with as minimal damage as possible. And I see that so many times with project work where it's like, all right, we already know we're not achieving the original goal. How do we manage to get the most value out of what we've got? What opportunity remains?
The book is no longer sufficient. We're in chart territory that the book doesn't adequately describe or guide us on.
Right.
So it's on us as principals or people who are responsible to manage it directly.
And I always feel
update the book.
Once that has happened or once that's happening, the Agilists are better suited to dealing with the problem than the traditional project managers.
That's my impression.
Because you're certainly in the complex space. You might be in the lower quadrant where everything's on fire and the only thing you can do is act. But we don't want to get there. So you can dance along the line between complicated and complex. You can also dance on the line between a total show and just a really dire situation.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, no, I think it's necessary. Again, it's not an either or. It's like you need the expectation, you need protocols, you need the way that you need the best of what we've learned up to this point about how to do this stuff. We want everybody to have that knowledge and be prepared for that moment when it comes. But then when we go outside that, it's like,
yeah.
we need to be clear. Okay, it's time to think in real time.
Yeah. What you're looking for is what's the right tool to apply in a situation.
How do we not all die here?
Right. And so, yeah. So to get back to the to make
Yes.
ourselves board certified agilists. I mean, there are attempts to do something like that, but I don't know that they do that. They just still more sound like pay us again. Give us pay us more money for you to take the same test again.
See,
Doesn't sound
maybe
like
that's where. Yeah, I'm a little bit skeptical of that. I don't, and maybe here's a way to think about it. I'm not super enthusiastic about maintaining a certification in a body of knowledge that is static, but I can see the value in maintaining membership in a community or a process that is always reevaluating and learning and adding to that knowledge, like the continual upgrading and looking at new stuff and integrating that new stuff that we learn. Confronting the unknown, figuring out how to integrate that, make a protocol out of that, and integrate that with our existing book, and that seems valuable.
Right. It certainly does, and and that's where the conferences come in handy because they're just learning opportunities. You can go in and see what other people have been doing. You can share what you've been doing, some insights that you've come up with, and finding a I don't know, a ready audience to hear that or debate it or talk about that.
Yeah.
So
Okay. So the question is, how does the PMI and the Agile Alliance merging affect the state of agility and agilists in January 2025? That's the question, and the answer is we don't know.
well, okay, so let's do this. There's a distinction to be made between the merger of two organizations that have memberships. This is a bureaucratic concept or a bureaucratic problem, right? They're going to somehow meld their organizations or leverage each other for that perspective. I think the more interesting question is what does it do for Agile and traditional project management execution? We probably should have a different word for that, right? And I don't want to call it waterfall because that's not actually the other side of the coin.
Yeah.
And I don't want to trigger anyone by just doing things. What does it mean for those two sets of practices, though, the complicated versus the complex practices? Does this merger affect that? Yeah.
Are you comfortable with a project versus product, or is that also too complex?
Maybe. I mean, like what started this was commenting on the LinkedInosphere and the responses to this. And the responses were many. There were a lot of posts, and it was, and most people, it seems, and this is just my perspective is that people used this news to amplify whatever their personal bias was.
That's what people tend to do, yeah.
So all the people who think Agile is dead looked at this and said, there it is. There's your proof that Agile is dead because they've joined the dark empire or whatever.
Yeah.
All the people who have been freaking out over the loosey-goosey nature of the Agile movement have said, oh, thank God, maybe now we'll get a little structure in this thing, right? Other people said maybe this results in a loss of clarity for both sides. I doubt that.
Yeah.
But when we had the APLN discussion, I think the conclusion we came to was maybe what this means is it will become more okay to make the appropriate choice when you're at that choice point. Right?
That would be great.
that you don't have to have somebody doing no, that's not Agile. You can't do that because the situation has changed and it's not Agile anymore. Now we'd be better served in this place, right? So let's just get comfortable with doing the right thing at the right time, right?
Yes.
Maybe we're not
Amen.
Agile coaches anymore. Maybe we're more organizational effectiveness coaches. What's the right thing to do, and how do we adapt to do those things? You can still adapt in a traditional project management environment. They call them change requests. They're crazy.
Well, and they're change requests because
Yeah.
they're changing
What the plan
the
was.
known scope and the known methods that were
Yes.
knowable at the start
Yeah.
because it was complicated, not complex.
I shouldn't have said they were crazy. That was a biased response. I still have a biased background. I'm sorry.
Hey, we're
I
all
admit it.
human
I admit
here.
it.
Yes, absolutely.
But I find value in both sides of the fence at different times. And I don't see any value in not having a pragmatic approach to choosing your path. And if that means we occasionally dance on one side of the aisle or the other side of the aisle, then so be it. That's where the dance is leading us.
To me, it sounds like, do you want a screwdriver or do you want a hammer? And the answer is yes.
Yeah. At
Yeah.
various
Why would I
times.
choose one? Yeah.
What's the combination of a hammer and a screwdriver look like?
Some useless thing. I mean, I guess it's a multi-tool, which, yeah. But
I don't know.
better than nothing, but like nowhere near as good as an optimized
Maybe a
tool.
hammer that the head rotates every time you slam it on something.
Oh God, I've used that tool. I've worked in that place. I left. Okay, so cool. I think we answered as much as we could. Maybe anything else to say?
Yeah. I think in summary, the merger is not. I think I'm hopeful that this could open up the lines of communication a little bit more. I don't see this as a downside. If any of you are out there panicking over this notion, I'd stop. Don't panic.
Well, I'm curious what your reaction is. So if you're a member of the PMI or you're a member of the Agile Alliance or,
Or just someone on the periphery who's not a member of either, but you find yourself playing in their world.
Yep. If you got an opinion, send an email to questions@htat.show or drop a comment on the YouTube that you must be looking at. I think that's the only way to contact us. And
I don't know if the audio podcasts have comment spaces.
no, I don't think so. That just goes straight to your podcatcher. You could also DM us on X at HTAT_dot_show. All spelled out. It's not confusing at all. I don't know what your problem is.
Okay, we'll put all these links in the down there in the details or on the screen, or those of you just listening.
Or if you flipped your phone.
Go to htat.show and we'll have a link there on the website that tells you where to find those other things.
That's right. Just use the hypertext protocol. That's simple enough.
There's something there.
Anyway, I feel like this has been an Agile thing, even though we should change the name of the podcast to something like Flow because Agile is dead. But it's been an Agile thing. I've been Matt Beam.
I've been Mike Markey. Thank you for joining us. See you next time.
See you next time.